Jack Raven Harlan had always felt most at home in the deep, quiet forests far from the bustling town. A seasoned survivalist with years of experience, he knew these woods like the back of his hand. The towering trees, the rustling leaves, and the occasional call of a distant animal were his companions. He preferred it this way, away from the complications of city life, and the people who didn't understand his need for solitude. But that day, as he trekked through the forest on his usual route, something felt different. The air was heavier, as if the forest itself held its breath. Jack's sharp eyes scanned his surroundings, sensing that something was out of place. His boots crunched softly on the forest floor as he moved forward, but then a strange noise broke the stillness, a loud metallic crack, followed by a fiery streak across the sky. His heart skipped a beat. It was no ordinary crash. Jack's instincts kicked in. He dropped to the ground, blending into the underbrush, careful not to draw attention. Whatever it wasn't from around here. The crash was close, and Jack, despite his usual detachment, felt a stirring curiosity. It wasn't long before he decided to investigate. Moving swiftly and silently, he made his way toward the source of the noise, carefully navigating the dense trees and thick undergrowth. As Jack approached the crash site, the air grew warmer and a faint glow illuminated the darkening forest. He peered around a massive oak, and there it was, a twisted wreckage of something clearly not human-made. The wreck was smoking, the metal cracked and twisted in a way no earthly technology could replicate. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The ship, or whatever it was, lay half submerged in a shallow ravine, its once sleek form now a heap of charred metal and wreckage. The smell of burning fuel lingered in the air. But what really caught Jack's attention was not the wreck itself. It was the figure lying motionless near it. A girl. At first, Jack thought she might be dead. She was sprawled on the ground, her body pale and unmoving. But as he knelt beside her, he noticed the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. Jack's gaze flicked across her strange appearance. Her skin had a soft, silver-blue sheen to it, almost as if it were reflecting the light from the fire. Her hair, long and flowing, shimmered with a strange metallic sheen, catching the dying light from the flames around them. The girl's features were delicate, yet something about her conveyed an undeniable strength. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, but it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. Carefully, he cradled her in his arms, lifting her from the ground. Her body felt light, too light for someone who seemed so solid. As Jack began to carry her away from the wreckage, a sudden thought hit him. How could he explain this? An alien crashing into his forest, and here he was, the lone human witnessing it. The thought of what to do next was overwhelming, but Jack pushed it aside. The girl needed help, and that was all that mattered for now. He would figure the rest out later. As he made his way back to his cabin, Jack could feel a growing unease gnawing at him. The crash might have been just the beginning of something much bigger. And though he couldn't know it yet, this decision, this simple act of rescuing a stranger, would change his life forever. Jack carefully carried the strange girl back to his cabin, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was she? Where did she come from? And why was she here? The forest was a long way from any major settlements, so how had she ended up crashing so far from civilization? Her strange appearance only deepened the mystery. Her skin had a soft, silvery glow, almost like the moonlight itself had touched her, and her hair shimmered in a way Jack had never seen before. Yet despite everything about her that felt alien, there was a certain peace in her stillness. She didn't look dangerous. She looked fragile. As Jack reached his cabin, he gently laid her down on his makeshift cot, a small space he used for resting after long days in the wilderness. The room was simple, sparse, with wooden walls and an old stove in the corner. He hadn't expected to ever use it for anything other than a refuge from the harsh weather. Now, it would serve as a place of refuge for someone who seemed to come from another world. The girl remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Jack didn't know much about medicine, but he had enough wilderness knowledge to know that she was alive, and that was enough for now. He grabbed a damp cloth and wiped the dirt and ash from her face, his hand trembling slightly as he noticed just how pale she was. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, their color a bright, almost glowing shade of purple. Jack froze, unsure of what to make of this. Was this some kind of trick, or was she not human? But before he could process it further, her eyes closed again, and she fell back into unconsciousness. Hours passed as Jack tended to her wounds, cleaning the small cuts on her arms and legs, even though he wasn't sure what could help her. He had no tools for alien medicine, after all. The whole situation felt surreal, like a dream. He kept glancing out the small window, half expecting to see some kind of government search party marching through the woods. He'd heard rumors of strange occurrences in nearby forests, military operations that never seemed to have explanations. But nothing came. It was just him and this mysterious girl, trapped in the middle of the wilderness. By the time the sun began to set, the girl's breathing had steadied, and her pale skin no longer seemed as lifeless. Jack sat back in his chair, exhausted but strangely relieved. He needed answers, but there was only one person who could give them to him: the girl. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was important, that her arrival here wasn't a coincidence. But for now, he had to wait. As the evening drew on, Jack made a small fire in the stove and warmed some water for tea. His mind kept racing. Who was she? Where was she from? And why had she chosen him? A quiet, isolated man with no ties to anyone, of all people, to help her. Suddenly, a soft groan broke the silence. Jack turned quickly, his heart leaping in his chest. The girl's eyes fluttered open again, this time more slowly, and she looked around the room with a confused expression. Her gaze landed on Jack, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. She seemed disoriented, but there was a calmness in her eyes, a knowing look that suggested she understood far more than Jack could imagine. Slowly, she raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and she spoke in a language Jack didn't recognize. The words were melodic, almost like a song, but the meaning was lost on him. She was speaking a language that wasn't from Earth. Jack blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of it. I don't understand," he said softly, unsure if she could even comprehend him. She looked at him for a moment, then raised an eyebrow, as though realizing the barrier between them. With a soft sigh, she closed her eyes, and Jack watched in awe as a strange light flickered around her hands. For a brief moment, he felt something shift in the air, like the atmosphere itself was bending to her will. Her voice, when she spoke again, was broken, but this time in a language Jack could comprehend. "I am Zyara. From the stars," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You saved me. Thank you." Jack blinked, his heart skipping a beat. Zyara. From the stars. He had no idea what it all meant, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. Jack sat across from Zyara, his mind still trying to process everything she had said. From the stars. The words echoed in his head, but they didn't seem real. He had heard rumors of UFO sightings and strange occurrences, but this was different. She didn't look like the alien beings from the sci-fi shows. She was beautiful, with her silver blue skin and glowing purple eyes. She looked human in many ways, but there was something about her that was undeniably otherworldly. Jack didn't know what to think. What he did know was that he couldn't just leave her out there alone, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to. He felt a responsibility to protect her. Zyara, on the other hand, seemed calm, even though Jack could see the fear hidden in her eyes. She was trying to hide it, but he could tell. Every now and then, her gaze would flick to the door or out the window, as if waiting for something or someone. Jack wasn't sure what she was expecting, but he could sense it wasn't good. Suddenly, a loud mechanical roar broke the silence of the cabin. Jack's heart stopped. His hand instinctively reached for the hunting knife he kept nearby, and he rose to his feet. Ziara's expression shifted from calm to tense in an instant, her eyes widening with alarm. "They're here," she whispered, barely audible. Jack's mind raced. He didn't know who they were, but it didn't matter. Someone, something, was coming for them. His hand gripped the knife tightly as he moved toward the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Several dark figures emerged from the trees, their heavy boots crunching against the snow-covered ground. They were men, but not like any Jack had seen before. They wore dark combat suits and carried weapons that looked more advanced than anything on Earth. Their movements were synchronized, efficient, as if they had done this 100 times before. Jack's stomach dropped. These weren't just soldiers, they were mercenaries. And they weren't here for a rescue mission. They were here for Ziara. "Get down," Jack hissed, pulling Ziara away from the window. He shoved her behind a table, crouching low beside her. Ziara's eyes locked onto his, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I told you they would come," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "They're after me. They've been hunting me for days." Jack didn't need to ask who they were. He could guess. Whoever these mercenaries were, they knew exactly what they were dealing with. And they were willing to do whatever it took to capture her. As Jack's mind raced, trying to think of an escape plan, the sounds of the mercenaries closing in grew louder. The door creaked, then shook under a heavy knock. Jack's heart thudded in his chest. He was trapped, and so was Ziara. There was no way out through the front. Without thinking, Jack grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back of the cabin. "We need to move now," he urged. Ziara, though clearly shaken, nodded. She seemed to understand that running was their only option. They dashed out the back door, the cold wind biting at their faces. The forest was their only cover now, and Jack knew this terrain like the back of his hand. He had hunted in these woods many times, using the trees and underbrush as his allies. But as they fled deeper into the forest, Jack felt an uneasy sense of urgency. They were after her, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. Ziara suddenly stopped, turning to Jack with an intense look. "I can help," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. She raised her hands, and Jack watched, awestruck, as the air around them shimmered. A soft blue glow radiated from her palms, and with a wave, the surrounding forest seemed to warp. Trees bent, branches shifted, and the mercenaries' footsteps faltered. They couldn't see them anymore. It was as if the forest itself had become a wall between them and their pursuers. "Keep moving," Ziara urged, her voice low but firm. She was using her powers to protect them, but Jack could sense she was tiring. He wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. They ran through the woods, zigzagging to confuse their pursuers, with Ziara's glowing energy creating illusions in their wake. Jack couldn't help but marvel at her abilities, but he also knew they wouldn't hold the mercenaries off forever. They needed to get somewhere safe. "Where can we hide?" Jack asked urgently. "I know a place," Ziara said. "Follow me." They moved faster, with Jack trusting Ziara's lead. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. The mercenaries were close, and every second counted. As they pushed through the dense underbrush, Jack heard something that made his stomach drop. Another roar, this one different. It was mechanical, the sound of a hovering craft, and it was drawing closer. They were being hunted, and their time was running out. Jack and Ziara moved quickly through the thick forest, their breaths shallow and urgent. The sound of the hovering craft grew louder, its low hum vibrating through the trees. Jack could hear it circling above, as if it were searching for them, scanning the ground for any sign of movement. The mercenaries were relentless, but Ziara was even more determined. Her powers, though impressive, were starting to weaken as the pressure mounted. She was clearly exhausted, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of worry for her. She had saved them from immediate danger, but the battle wasn't over yet. Almost there, Zyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing noise above. I know a place, an old shelter. It's hidden. They won't find us there. Jack nodded, trusting her. He didn't have much choice. The mercenaries were closing in, and he could feel the tension in the air. Every second felt like it could be their last. He glanced back, trying to assess how much time they had left, but there was no way of knowing. The craft was getting closer, its sound now almost deafening. They pushed through the dense underbrush, navigating through the trees with practiced speed. Jack could barely keep up with Zyra, who seemed to glide through the forest with an unnatural grace. It was like she knew exactly where she was going, each step measured and purposeful. Jack was beginning to realize just how much more she was capable of, and it only made him more desperate to protect her. Finally, Zyra stopped in front of a large boulder, its surface covered in moss and vines. She placed her hand on it, and Jack watched in awe as the stone seemed to shift, sliding away to reveal a hidden opening beneath. It was an old cave, one Jack had never seen before. It was almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Get inside, Zyra urged, her voice strained. Quickly. Without hesitation, Jack pulled her into the cave, and the boulder slid back into place, sealing them in darkness. The sound of the hovering craft grew faint, but it still lingered in the distance, as if waiting for them to emerge. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He took a moment to catch his breath, but Zyra was already moving, her glowing hands lighting up the cavern with a soft blue light. The cave was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. It wasn't much, just a small, natural shelter with walls that looked like they had been carved by centuries of erosion. Jack couldn't help but wonder how Zyra had found this place, or how she knew about it. She moved with purpose, scanning the cave's interior before turning to Jack. We can rest here for a while, she said, though her voice was weak, the energy drained from her. She slumped against one of the walls, her silver-blue skin still glowing faintly. I can't keep up the illusions for much longer. They're going to find us soon, and we'll have to run again. Jack nodded, but he wasn't ready to accept that. He couldn't let them keep running forever. They needed a plan. He looked around, his mind racing for options. The cave might provide temporary shelter, but they couldn't stay here long. They had to figure out who was behind the attack and why Zyra was so important. She seemed to know more than she was telling him, but Jack wasn't going to press her for answers. Not yet. She had been through enough. We need to keep moving, Jack said after a long silence. But first, tell me more. Who are they? And why are they after you? Zyra closed her eyes, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. They're mercenaries, hired by a group from my world, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. They've been chasing me for months, trying to capture me. I escaped, but I'm not the only one they want. There's something they need from me, something they think I have, but they won't stop until they get it. Jack's mind whirled with questions. What could be so important about her that they would go to such lengths? Who were these people, and what did they want from her? He didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Zyra was in danger, and he wasn't about to let anyone take her without a fight. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, he said, his voice firm. We'll figure it out. Together. Zyra's eyes softened, a small flicker of hope appearing behind her tired gaze. Thank you, Jack, she whispered. You don't know how much that means to me. But even as she spoke, Jack's gut told him that their troubles were far from over. The mercenaries were still out there, and soon they would be back. And next time, they might not give them a chance to escape. The cave was cold, and Jack could feel the weight of their situation settling in. The sound of the hovering craft outside still echoed faintly through the trees, like a predator circling its prey. He knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. Zyra was still recovering from her energy drain, her glowing hands flickering weakly. Jack felt an overwhelming need to protect her, but he had no idea how to fight these mercenaries, or what they wanted from her. He stood up, pacing back and forth in the narrow space. The cave, while a good temporary refuge, wasn't a long-term solution, and the more time they spent hiding, the closer the mercenaries would get. He needed to think of a way out. His eyes kept flicking to Ziara, who was sitting against the wall, her eyes closed as if trying to conserve energy. "Ziara," Jack said, his voice soft but urgent. "I need you to tell me everything. Why are they chasing you? What do they want?" Ziara looked up at him, her violet eyes tired but steady. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "The mercenaries. They work for a powerful group. They call themselves the Xanth. They've been hunting me because I'm the last of my kind, the last of the Starborn." Jack frowned, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "Starborn? What does that mean?" Ziara closed her eyes for a moment before continuing. "We are a race that once lived among the stars. Our people were known for their abilities that could shape the very fabric of space and time. But my world was destroyed in a war, and I was one of the few survivors. The Xanth, they're obsessed with gaining control of our powers. They want to use me to take over entire galaxies." Jack's mind was racing. This was far beyond anything he could have imagined. An alien race capable of manipulating space and time, and a group of mercenaries chasing after one of the last survivors. But the more Ziara spoke, the clearer it became that her survival meant more than just her life. If the Xanth got their hands on her, they could destroy everything. "So they'll stop at nothing to get you," Jack said, his voice firm. "And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way, including me." Ziara nodded slowly, her face shadowed with fear. "Yes, they believe that I hold the key to unlocking the full power of the Starborn. If they find me, they'll force me to help them. And I can't let that happen." Jack felt a surge of determination. He didn't know much about these Xanth, but he knew that they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and he wasn't going to let them take Ziara, not without a fight. "You're not going to face them alone," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "We'll figure out how to stop them, together." Ziara looked at him, her tired eyes filled with gratitude, but also concern. "You don't know what you're up against, Jack. They have technology beyond anything your world has seen. They can track us, find us, no matter how far we run. And if they capture me, they'll use me to destroy everything you know." Jack didn't care. He couldn't let her face this on her own. "I've lived in these woods for years," he said, his jaw tightening. "I know how to survive. And I'm not letting them take you. We'll find a way to beat them." Ziara's expression softened, but her exhaustion was evident. "You're brave, Jack. But I need more than just bravery. I need to get to a place where I can contact my people. If I can reach them, they can help. But the Xanth have blocked my communication. They're always one step ahead." Jack thought for a moment. "So we need to get you to a place where you can send a message." Ziara nodded. "There's a relay station hidden in the mountains to the north. It's an old outpost, abandoned long ago, but it could still work. If we can reach it, I can send a distress signal to my people." Jack's heart raced with new purpose. The mountains to the north were treacherous, full of dangerous terrain and harsh weather, but it was their only hope, and Jack wasn't about to let anything stop them. "We leave now," Jack said, determination clear in his voice. "We can't wait any longer." Ziara hesitated, looking at him with a mixture of relief and worry. "Are you sure? The mercenaries are still out there, and they'll be looking for us." "I'm sure," Jack replied. "We move fast, stay low, and we'll make it." The sound of the hovering craft was still faint, but it was drawing closer. Jack's instincts told him that it was time to move, before they were found. As they made their way out of the cave, Jack glanced at Ziara one last time. "We're in this together. You won't be alone." With that, they stepped into the cold night. the threat of the Xanth hanging over them. But Jack was ready to fight, and with Ziara by his side, he felt a strange sense of hope. The cold wind bit at Jack's face as he and Ziara made their way through the dense forest, each step pushing them closer to the mountains. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds overhead. It was a long journey ahead, and Jack could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. Every moment they spent out in the open made them more vulnerable. The mercenaries were still out there, and he had no doubt they were closing in. Ziara was silent beside him, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees, her movements slower than usual. Jack could tell she was pushing herself too hard. She was still recovering from using her powers back in the cave, and even though she didn't show it, her energy was running low. Jack couldn't help but worry. "We're getting close," Ziara said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The trail to the mountains starts just up ahead. We need to be careful. The mercenaries know the area well." Jack nodded, his hand instinctively tightening around the knife at his side. He wasn't sure what they would face in the mountains, but he wasn't going to let anything happen to Ziara. He had to trust that they could make it, even with the odds stacked against them. As they approached the base of the mountain, the forest began to thin, and the terrain became rockier. The ground underfoot grew uneven, making every step more difficult. Jack's legs were already starting to ache, but he ignored the pain. They couldn't afford to slow down. The sound of the hovering craft was still in the distance, but it was getting closer. Jack glanced back once, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing in sight. Yet, his gut told him they weren't alone. The Xanthi would be searching for them, using every tool at their disposal. Ziara stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to signal for Jack to stop. Her senses were sharper than his, and he trusted her instincts. They both crouched down behind a large boulder, hiding from any possible onlookers. The sound of the hovering craft was growing louder, and Jack could feel the tension in the air. "They're near," Ziara whispered. "They've spotted us. We need to move, quickly." Jack's heart raced. They couldn't let the mercenaries catch up now. They had to get to the mountain pass, where they could find the relay station Ziara had mentioned. But every step they took was a risk, and Jack knew the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. The ground beneath them was slippery, the rocks slick with the moisture from the night air. Ziara took the lead, her pace quickening as she navigated the treacherous terrain. Jack followed close behind, trying to keep up with her despite the harsh conditions. The climb was steep, the path winding upward through sharp rocks and dense underbrush. After what felt like hours of hiking, they reached a small clearing at the base of a steep cliff. The mountain loomed ahead, its peak hidden by the mist that hung in the air. Jack could see the faint outline of a narrow trail cutting into the rock face, leading up to the higher altitudes. This was the trail that would take them to the relay station. But it wasn't just the trail that caught Jack's attention. In the distance, he could make out the shadowy figures of the mercenaries, their dark silhouettes moving swiftly through the forest. They were getting closer. "They're not far behind," Ziara said, her voice tight with worry. "We need to climb. Now." Without hesitation, Jack followed her toward the cliff. The path was narrow, winding around jagged rocks and steep drops. The climb was grueling, and Jack's arms and legs burned with the effort, but there was no choice. They couldn't stop now. Ziara moved with surprising agility, her feet finding footholds where Jack could barely see any. Jack's focus was solely on keeping up with her, trying not to look down at the dizzying height below. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up, howling around them, and making the rocks even more treacherous. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He glanced down and saw a flash of movement. The mercenaries had reached the base of the cliff. They were closing in, their movements swift and purposeful. They were trying to climb after them. "We need to hurry," Jack urged, his voice strained. Ziara didn't need to be told twice. She pushed forward, her glowing hands lighting the way as she pulled herself up the cliff face. Jack followed, his every muscle screaming in protest. The sound of the mercenaries' pursuit grew louder, their footsteps gaining ground. Jack's mind raced. They couldn't stop now. They had to reach the top. As the wind howled around them, Jack's fingers found a solid hold in the rock, and he pulled himself up, his heart pounding with every inch. He glanced at Ciara, who was just ahead, her face set in determination. They were so close, and the mercenaries. They were right behind them. The cliff seemed to stretch endlessly before Jack and Zara. The higher they climbed, the more perilous it became. Their fingers scraped against rough rocks, their legs burning from the effort. The mercenaries were getting closer, their voices faint but unmistakable, echoing off the mountain walls. Jack could hear the desperation in their pursuit. They had no intention of giving up, not after getting so close. Zara's pace remained steady, despite the obvious toll it was taking on her. She was more than capable, but Jack could tell that even she was feeling the strain. She had used so much energy already, and the climb was only getting more demanding. Jack wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up. "Zara," Jack called out, his voice filled with concern. "We can't keep going like this. We need to find a way to throw them off our trail. They're right behind us." Zara didn't answer immediately, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened. Her glowing hands flickered in the dim light, the energy clearly draining from her. "I know," she said, her voice hoarse. "We need to keep moving, but we don't have much time. The relay station is close, but—" She trailed off, her gaze distant. Jack could tell that there was something she wasn't telling him. Something more. But now wasn't the time for questions. "We'll make it," Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We have to." But as the minutes passed, the air grew colder and the wind harsher. Their progress slowed. Every step seemed to take more effort than the last. Jack could feel the weight of the mercenaries' presence growing closer with every passing second. His heart hammered in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder again, seeing the dark shapes of their pursuers becoming clearer as they gained on them. "We have to do something, Jack," Zara said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "If they catch us." Her words hung in the air like a chilling morning. If the mercenaries caught them, there would be no escape. Jack's stomach tightened. They needed a plan, and fast. Suddenly, Zara stopped, her eyes widening as she glanced upward. Jack followed her gaze, his heart racing. Far above them, in the distance, he could see the faint outline of the relay station, nestled at the top of a higher ridge. It was a beacon of hope, but the path to it was almost too dangerous. It seemed impossible, even with everything they had already endured. "I can get us there," Zara said, her voice tight with resolve. She was speaking to herself as much as to Jack, as if weighing the odds. "But it's going to require everything I have left." Jack looked at her, his mind racing. She had already pushed herself so far, and now she was willing to risk even more. She couldn't keep using her powers like this, but what choice did they have? If they didn't reach the station, they were as good as caught. "I'll do whatever it takes," Zara continued, her eyes meeting his. "But I need you to trust me, Jack." Jack hesitated, but only for a moment. He had no reason not to trust her. She had already proven time and time again that she was capable, far more than anyone he could have imagined. And even though the idea of putting her through more was terrifying, he knew that this was their only shot. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I trust you." Without another word, Zara closed her eyes, her breathing shallow as she focused all of her remaining energy. Jack felt the air around them begin to shift, the temperature dropping as the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar power. He had seen her abilities in action before, but this was different. This wasn't just an illusion or a shield. This was something deeper, more intense. He could feel it in his bones. The next moment, the ground under them shifted as if they were being pulled upward by an invisible force. The world blurred around them, the landscape melting into a swirl of colors and lights. Jack's heart raced as he tried to hold on, his grip slipping on the rocks beneath him. It was like falling through space itself, everything spinning around him as he clung to Ziara. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice barely audible through the overwhelming sensation. For a moment, Jack felt like they were weightless, floating through the air, until the sensation stopped as abruptly as it had started. They had reached the top. Jack stumbled, disoriented, his legs unsteady as he tried to regain his balance. Ziara was already standing, her energy still glowing faintly, but her face was pale, her breath labored. She had pushed herself to the limit. I got us here," she whispered, her voice weak. Jack looked around, his heart pounding. They were on a narrow ridge, the relay station just a few hundred feet ahead. But as they caught their breath, Jack's eyes flicked nervously to the horizon. The mercenaries were close, too close. They had no time to waste. The cold wind whipped around Jack and Ziara as they stood on the narrow ridge, barely catching their breath. The relay station was now in sight, just a short distance away, but they couldn't afford to take their time. The mercenaries were close, and Jack could hear their voices in the distance, shouting orders and growing louder with every passing second. They had no more room to waste. They had to move now, or risk being caught. Ziara, though clearly exhausted, didn't hesitate. She took a step forward, her glowing hands dim, but still radiating a faint energy. Jack followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. The path was narrow, with jagged rocks jutting out, but Ziara moved with determination, her eyes focused on the distant structure that could mean their salvation. The relay station was a simple outpost, barely standing against the winds, its metal frame creaking in the cold. But to Ziara, it was more than just a structure. It was the key to reaching her people, to finally ending the mercenaries' relentless pursuit. They couldn't afford to fail now. As they neared the station, Ziara's pace slowed. Jack could see the strain in her every movement. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling. She had given everything. She had to get them this far. The energy she had used to shift them to the top of the ridge had drained her more than she had let on. "Ziara," Jack said, his voice full of concern. "You don't have to do this. I can try to send the signal. You need to rest." Ziara looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength, but also the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. "I don't have time to rest, Jack. The Xanthi are close. If I don't contact my people now, they'll never stop hunting me." Jack didn't argue. He could see the urgency in her eyes, and despite his fear for her, he knew she was right. This was their only chance. With a deep breath, Ziara reached for the door of the relay station. It was old, the metal rusted and creaking, but it opened with a soft hiss as if it had been waiting for them all this time. The inside was dark, but there was a faint light from the console in the center of the room. Ziara moved toward it immediately, her steps shaky but determined. Jack watched her, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "They're almost here," Jack said under his breath. Turning back to Ziara, she was already working at the console, her hands trembling as she activated the ancient equipment. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, but she kept her focus, her fingers flying across the screen. "I need a few more seconds," she murmured, her voice tight. Jack glanced back outside. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable now. The mercenaries were close, too close. "Ziara," Jack said urgently, "they're almost here. We don't have much time." "I know," Ziara replied, her voice strained as she worked faster. "I'm almost there. Just hold them off for a bit longer." Jack's heart was in his throat. He couldn't fight the mercenaries on his own, not with their advanced weapons and technology. But he had to try. He couldn't let them get to Ziara. Not now. He looked around the small room, finding a rusted pipe lying in a corner. It wasn't much, but it was something. He grabbed it and moved to the entrance, his grip tight on the makeshift weapon. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Jack's eyes darted to the darkening sky. The mercenaries were almost upon them. He had to do something, anything, to slow them down. As the first figure appeared on the horizon, Jack took a deep breath and stepped out from the station, brandishing the pipe. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. The mercenaries, dressed in dark, tactical gear, spotted him immediately. They paused, clearly surprised to see someone standing in their way. But Jack didn't wait for them to react. He rushed at the closest one, swinging the pipe with all the force he could muster. The mercenary barely had time to react before the pipe collided with his chest, knocking him off balance. "Stay away from her," Jack shouted, his voice raw with determination. The mercenaries hesitated for just a moment. But that moment was enough. Jack had bought Zara the time she needed. Inside, Zara let out a breath of relief as the console beeped, signaling that the message had been sent. Her people would know they were here, and help would be on the way. She glanced up at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. But there was no time to celebrate. The mercenaries were regrouping, and Jack could see that they were ready to attack. Zara stepped forward, her strength returning, her hands glowing brighter. "We have what we need," she said firmly, her voice strong again. "Let's finish this." Jack nodded, his heart pounding with the weight of what was to come. They were not done yet, but together they could face whatever came next. The mercenaries were closing in fast, their heavy footsteps thudding against the rocky ground. Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The time to hide was over. There was no more running, no more distractions. This was it. He and Zara would have to face the Xanthi head-on. Jack glanced at Zara, whose glowing hands were already crackling with energy, ready for the fight. She stood tall, despite the exhaustion that had drained her body. Her face was determined, her eyes locked onto the mercenaries. Jack knew she was not just fighting for her own survival anymore. This was for her people, for everything that had been taken from her, and for the future they could still build. Jack tightened his grip on the pipe, now more of a weapon than a mere tool. He had no illusion that he could take down all of the mercenaries on his own, but he would fight with everything he had. Zara had already sacrificed so much for him, and he would not let her down. They were in this together now. There was no going back. As the first mercenary stepped into the clearing, Zara raised her hands, and a wave of energy burst forth, sending a shockwave that knocked the mercenary off his feet. He landed hard on the ground, but before he could recover, Zara had already moved to the next one. Her movements were swift and precise, each strike sending an invisible force that sent the enemy tumbling backward. Jack watched in awe. He had seen her abilities before, but never like this. Her power, though weakened, was still formidable. But the mercenaries were not without their own tricks. One of them, taller and more imposing than the rest, pulled out a blaster from his side, aiming it at Zara. Jack reacted instinctively, hurling the pipe at the man with all his might. The pipe hit the blaster's barrel, knocking it off course just as the mercenary fired. The shot missed by inches, but the momentary distraction was enough for Zara to move in. She raised her hands once more, a burst of energy crashing into the mercenary, sending him sprawling backward, unconscious. Another mercenary charged toward Jack, his weapon raised high. Jack barely had time to react as the man swung at him. With a quick sidestep, Jack dodged the blow, swinging the pipe upward and striking the mercenary across the ribs. The man grunted in pain, but didn't go down. Jack swung again, this time aiming for the man's head, but the mercenary blocked it with his arm, knocking the pipe from Jack's hands. Jack stepped back, his heart racing. He didn't have a weapon now, but he wasn't about to give up. He wasn't alone. Zara was still fighting, her glowing hands flashing with each movement, incapacitating mercenary after mercenary. Jack's pulse quickened as he grabbed a loose rock from the ground, hurling it at the mercenary in front of him. It hit the man square in the face, giving Jack the opening he needed. With a swift move, he tackled the mercenary to the ground. pinning him long enough to land a solid punch. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Jack realized more mercenaries were arriving. The numbers were beginning to overwhelm them. Ziara was panting, her movements slower now, and Jack could see the strain in her face. She couldn't keep this up forever. "We can't keep fighting like this," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's too many of them." Ziara looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're almost there, Jack. I just need a little more time. Hold them off just a little longer." Jack nodded, though every part of him screamed for them to run. But they didn't have that option anymore. Ziara was right. They were so close. He couldn't fail now. The remaining mercenaries regrouped, and Jack steeled himself for the final push. As the first of them lunged forward, Ziara unleashed a powerful burst of energy that sent shockwaves through the ground, throwing the mercenaries back. It was a calculated move, one that took everything she had left. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he watched her stagger, clearly drained, but there was no turning back now. With their enemies momentarily stunned, Jack grabbed Ziara's arm, pulling her toward the relay station. They had to make it there, no matter the cost. The path to freedom was in sight. They could hear the hum of the station's equipment in the distance, a promise of salvation. But the mercenaries weren't done yet. They were coming. As they neared the station, Ziara stumbled, her energy flickering. Jack quickly turned, grabbing her and holding her steady. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice full of hope. "Just a little more." They had one final chance. The mercenaries were closing in, but they were stronger together. Jack knew that this was it. The moment they would either win or lose. He had no intention of losing.